West Ham are terrible right now. After losing their 5th straight game in the league against Brentford, many eyes have been on David Moyes, with various hammers calling for him to be sacked, as the club are just one place above the drop and only ahead on goal difference. And if somebody showed you this table pretty much 3 years ago to this day, you'd be forgiven for thinking pretty much no progress had been made in the Scotsman's return to the club. That's not quite what happened, is it? This is the story of West Ham's remarkable 3-year spell since David Moyes rejoined the club on the 29th of December 2019. Now, despite this being the date when he rejoined the club, it's not where I think this story really started. So let's rewind to the 10th of May 2016, where West Ham played Manchester United in the final game at Upton Park. From pretty much the day West Ham United had been renamed from Thames Ironworks, the club played their football at the Bowling Ground, often referred to as simply Upton Park. The ground had history, character, noise, and most importantly, no room to grow. With a capacity of just 35,000, owners Gold & Sullivan had been desperate to move the club out of Upton Park from the day they bought it, with the empty Olympic Stadium just a couple miles away, giving them the perfect opportunity to turn the club into more of a commercial powerhouse. With the London Stadium having nearly double the number of potential spectators, G&S made it their priority to win the bid to lease the ground, with their main rivals being League One Leyton Orient, who would have had to rename the club to London Orient FC if they wanted to occupy the stadium, something that the Orient faithful were outraged by and likely would not have stood for had it come into fruition, meaning West Ham quite easily secured the ground. And so, after a delayed kickoff to their final fixture at Upton Park, Diafra Sakho put West Ham ahead before they were pegged back to 2-1 down by 2 second-half goals from Anthony Martial. The second of these 2 goals would be in the 72nd minute, in which the game and ground, which had already been lively as you'd expect, shot to life. 4 minutes later, Mikel Antonio scored, before Winston Reid put the Hammers ahead yet again, another 4 minutes later. The last 10 minutes saw an absolutely electric atmosphere, helping West Ham to hold on and win the farewell game to the ground that had been home to West Ham for 112 years. And after a few impressive seasons, in which they built significant momentum and qualified for the Europa League for the 2nd year in a row, West Ham went into the 2016-17 season completely flat. It seemed the club had completely lost its soul, not just with the new stadium, but with everything that came with it. Fans couldn't eat at the places they used to, or drink at the pubs they knew. Everything was more expensive and harder to get to. Even the badge of the club had changed. Money was splashed on underperforming signings, and a team which just months previously had been one of the most tight-knit communities in football, surrounded by hundreds of years of character, became just another club in the league, and an average one at that. After 6 games, the club had started a short period in the relegation zone, and by mid-December they were still only 17th, winning just 3 games from 15 in the league, and had been knocked out of the Europa League for the 2nd year in a row by go! Come the end of the season, and things would gradually improve for the Hammers, finishing 11th place, but having just the 16th best home form in the league, compared to the 7th best the year previously. And it wasn't just a one-off bad year either. For the next 3 seasons, they'd spend time in the relegation zone in each campaign, before going on to finish mid-table, despite having had 3 separate managers across this period. And after the final game of 2019 saw the club in 17th place, with just 3 wins in the last 13 games, West Ham looked destined for the drop. The club was toxic from top to bottom, with fans calling for the heads of pretty much anyone at the club, and Manuel Pellegrini ended up being fired. A day later, and of course David Moyes would be his replacement, having turned around their fortunes 2 seasons previously, in which he'd taken over from Slaven Bilic with the club in the relegation zone. However, West Ham fans weren't too inspired. They'd replaced a man who'd won Premier League and European trophies to the man who'd been already deemed as not good enough for the job, and replaced by Pellegrini just 18 months previously. Mix into this a star player who'd been trying to force himself out of the club with each transfer window that went by, before finally doing so just before the season started, and you've got the recipe for a very poor home atmosphere. Despite winning his first game in charge, Moyes would be unable to see any progress by mid-March, winning just 1 more game up until football stopped completely and the entire world entered lockdown. Entering the pandemic, and West Ham were level on points with 18th place Bournemouth, only ahead of the drop by a goal difference superior by just 3, and were without the fans, who'd been so important for the club throughout pretty much the entirety of their 125-year history. On the 20th of June, they kicked off again, losing their opening 2 games to Wolves and Bournemouth, having just 4 attempts on goal over the 2 fixtures combined, before hosting Chelsea in their second game at the London Stadium without spectators. Willian opened the scoring for the Blues, but just minutes later, Souček equalised going into the break. Then after half-time, something had clicked. In the 52nd minute, Antonio scored to put them ahead, and despite being pegged back 20 minutes later, Antonio had played Yarmolenko through in the final minute, who'd scored the winner and put West Ham back in the right direction. A 2-2 draw to Newcastle and a 1-0 loss to Burnley would follow, as the club played 270 minutes of football and travelled nearly 600 miles in just 1 week before they found themselves away to fellow relegation rivals Norwich, where by the 74th minute, Antonio had scored 4 by himself as West Ham drew a full 3 points clear of the relegation zone. In the next game they'd beat another relegation rival in Watford, with Antonio scoring again, as well as midfield duo Souček and Rice both getting on the score sheet. I bring up Souček and Rice because they were quite literally pivotal in West Ham's upturn in form, with David Moyes playing them in a double pivot in a 4-2-3-1 formation, which became iconic to the Irons over the last few seasons. After 2 draws to end the campaign against Manchester United and Aston Villa, Moyes had finally started to make his mark on his side, with the club having lost just 1 of their final 7 games and conceding just 8 goals in that time frame, almost halving the rate at which West Ham were pulling the ball out of their own net. After years of spending heavily on transfers since moving to the London Stadium, West Ham had seen their side go backwards in terms of performances, and so David Moyes knew that with the pandemic having led West Ham to a loss of nearly £40 million, he wouldn't be given a huge budget, and so knew he had to transform an underperforming squad into one that could steer well clear of the drop zone, with very few additions, if any at all. His first job was to offload any players he felt were simply not good enough, or were actually detrimental to the performance of the squad. Pablo Zabaleta, Carlos Sanchez, Jeremy Ngakia, Albion Ayeti, Jordan Hugill, Roberto, Josh Cullen, Grady Diangana, Winston Reid, and Jack Wilshere were among those that had been released or were sold before anyone else could come in, with Vladimir Coufal, Craig Dawson, and Saeed Benrahma joining the club in October, after the season had already started. Despite losing the opening 2 games, the Irons then saw their best start to a season in 5 years, as for the first time since moving to Stratford, they hadn't fallen into the relegation zone, and by the end of November, just 10 games into the season, they found themselves in 5th. It would be after the first 2 losses of the season and the signing of Vladimir Coufal, where David Moyes would switch to a 5 at the back, probably due to the fact he didn't want to risk the Hammers slipping back into bad habits and aimed to stop the rot before it even started. The dynamism in the midfield duo of Souček and Rice allowed this to be possible, as well as Coufal hitting the ground running, having the stability to play as a wing-back, but also tucking inside or further back if his companion Masuaku was further forward on the opposite flank. Furthermore, the form and profile of Antonio in the new season continued to be remarkable and effective, allowing West Ham to play it long if they had to, and helping them combat high-pressing teams, alongside the emergence of Jarrod Bowen, who despite being signed in January, had taken a while to get settled in the capital. Bowen's intelligent runs in behind the backline made it significantly more hard for defenders to deal with the long balls to Antonio, as they knew they would be vulnerable to a knock-on to Bowen if they were to play a high line, or even to Souček, who would so often make a run from deep, with one of, if not both wingers, then tucking inside into midfield for late runs into the box. Come January, and West Ham was settled in a 10th place position, 7 places higher up the table than just a year previously when Moyes had joined the club, and throughout November and December, he'd chosen to move the team back into the 4-2-3-1, allowing them to play attacking football more often. However, with this came the need to bring in a new number 10, and so West Ham looked to the loan market, bringing in Jesse Lingard, who following a very difficult period off and on the pitch, was looking for a fresh start, scoring 2 goals on his debut, as well as another 5 goal contributions in his next 6 games, earning him a call up to England, and guiding the Irons to 4th in the table by the 31st match week. A stat so important, because exactly 1 Prem season previously, the Hammers had played their final game in front of fans, with the club looking relegation in the eyes. Jesse Lingard was the perfect signing for West Ham in this period, as with fans having been at home and unable to voice their frustrations in the stadium, it allowed him and the rest of the squad to regain their confidence and start playing to the best of their ability. This, matched with Lingard's feel-good personality, meant that by the time West Ham fans had returned to stadiums for the final match of the season, with the club needing a win to secure Europa League qualification, they were in love with the team they'd been watching at home. West Ham would win the final game of the season 3-0 against Southampton, with Fornal scoring 2 and assisting the other, having been the perfect example of what this West Ham team stood for all season, through his willingness to work for the team, and not just himself. In pretty much 12 months exactly, Moyes had turned a team destined for the championship round, and uncovered a fan base which had been within its shell since its move away from the ground it loved so much, after being away from football for so long. And so the work David Moyes had put in meant for the first time ever, when 10,000 Hammers came back to the stadium on the final game of the season, it felt like home. With the extra European money, and the likes of Haller and Snodgrass having been sold in January, Moyes had a little bit more money to spend, bringing in Alex Krau and Alphonse Areola on loan with option to buy, and spending around 30 million on each of Kurt Zouma and Nikola Vlasic, who was expected to be the replacement for Jesse Lingard. Antonio would once again start the new season on fire, as West Ham won their opening game for the first time in 6 years, and their opening 2 for the first time in over 2 decades, finding themselves top of the league after a 4-1 win against Leicester. If we then skip forwards a bit to November, and the Irons were continuing to prove the doubters wrong, finding themselves top of the group and unbeaten in the Europa League, as well as 4th in the Prem, following a 3-2 win against Liverpool, seeing them rise up to 3rd in the league and overtaking the side they'd just beaten. Following this win though, West Ham would see a dip in form, winning just one of their next 7 league fixtures, finding themselves in in 5th going into the new year, after a win against Watford on the 28th of December, exactly 2 years since Pellegrini was sacked, and a perfect example which could show just how far the Hammers had come. In 2021, they'd qualified for the Europa League, topped their group, knocked back-to-back Carabao Cup champions Man City out of the competition, and then started the new year 2022 incredibly, losing just 2 games by March in all competitions. The likes of Bowen, Dawson, Zuma, and most importantly Rice were impressive yet again, with Declan Rice the man I want to focus on the most. When Moyes first came in, Rice had featured next to Souček as the deeper line midfielder, being used more to shield the defence, and doing so impressively. But having been just 20 when Moyes was hired, the midfielder continued to grow as a player, with the evolution of the team being pretty much built around how Rice evolved as a player. As he became more confident with the ball at his feet in 2020, he was able to show off more of his passing ability, transitioning his role into much more of a playmaker, as he was a shielder of the back four. And as Mark Noble started to play less and less, Rice became a player those around him looked up to, almost forcing Moyes into making him a captain when Noble wasn't playing. By the Euros in 2021, Rice had become a player who was able to drive with the ball, allowing the wingers to stay further forward rather than coming deep to be involved in the build-up play, and thus making their counter-attacking style even more dangerous. Declan Rice had always been able to do this, but with the pressure of being a fan favourite from the second he joined the first team, in a club which saw the supporters constantly angry and disappointed, finally being lifted off his shoulders with lockdown, he was able to flourish. See, in 2021, West Ham had been incredible, but in 2022, Declan Rice had. In February, West Ham was seconds away from being knocked out of the FA Cup to non-league Kidderminster Harriers. Up stepped Declan Rice. He scored the equaliser in the last minute as West Ham went on to win after extra time. In March, with West Ham in their worst patch of form in 2 years, and the club 1-0 down on aggregate to a very successful and experienced Sevilla side in the Europa League, up stepped Declan Rice, dragging them through to the quarters in a dominant midfield display. And when in said quarters, West Ham found themselves without their starting left-backs away in Lyon, up stepped Declan Rice, scoring just before half-time to help secure a 3-0 win on the night. And when West Ham faced an injury crisis late in the season, which threatened to derail potential qualification for Europe in the next campaign, Declan Rice's performance reached the next level, just about carrying the side over the line come the end of the season. However, they had been knocked out of Europe to Frankfurt in the semi-finals, and with just 1 win in the final 2 months of the season, you can imagine that this team had reached its limit. With Rice shining brighter and brighter, it was easy to ignore the fact that many of West Ham's other players were starting to falter. As the year went on, Antonio, Benrahma, Bowen and Souček, among others, started to lose a bit of form, with the squad having been stretched to its limits. And so finally, Moyes was given the opportunity to spend big in the summer. But as I mentioned earlier, Noble had just finished his final season as a player, and in him, West Ham lost something you simply can't buy in the transfer window. For 18 years, Noble was an ever-present at the club. In some ways, he was the club. He'd seen the good times and the bad ones, and going into the new season without him was entering the unknown. And despite West Ham's form having been average at best all year, this is what I think was truly the turning point in the tenure of David Moyes at West Ham. In the summer, West Ham spent a lot, and I mean a lot. Permanent deals for Paqueta, Scamacca, Aguerd, Cornet, Emerson, Kehrer, Downs and Areola all took place, for a combined cost of over £150 million, and yet so far, none have been able to massively impress. West Ham lost their opening 3 matches, winning just 1 of their first 7, and despite a good run of form just before the World Cup pulling them out of the drop zone, look in real trouble of being relegated. Not only this, but they were knocked out of the EFL Cup to lower league opposition and haven't had a single player score more than 3 goals in the Premier League this season. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what has gone wrong for West Ham, but to put it simply, pretty much everything has. You could easily say teams have started to work their irons out, and as much as that is true to an extent, it's not really what's making them lose games. For example, everybody had worked out Pep Guardiola's Barcelona side by 2011, and yet nobody could beat them. There's a variety of problems at West Ham right now. Firstly, having a squad so small for so long, meaning that some West Ham players have just burnt out. Cresswell and Soufal went from statistically the second best fullback partnership in the league to a liability at times, and far from producing that attacking output we once saw of them. Not only this, but build-up play has become a real issue at the London Stadium. Long balls have often been far less accurate than in recent seasons, and the midfield duo of Souček and Rice have been far less progressive in passing and runs they're making, often leaving the likes of Bowen, Fornals, Antonio, Scamacca and Paqueta isolated from each other, as well as the rest of the team. However, there's been one shining light for the Hammers this year: the Conference League. So far, West Ham have played 8 games in the tournament and have won every single one of them, with the club already through to the last 16, scoring the same number of goals in the 6 group stages alone as they have in the entire Premier League campaign. And so, 1 year after finding themselves on the verge of the Champions League spots, West Ham are back in the exact same position they were when David Moyes took over nearly 3 years ago to the day, except they've done it in style. Last season, they scored in every home league game for the first time since the 90s, and so, regardless of if David Moyes finds himself on a way out soon, you can truly say that 5 years after moving grounds from Upton Park to the Olympic Stadium, David Moyes has made it West Ham's home. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, comment and subscribe. All my socials are linked in the description, but most importantly, thanks for watching and enjoy your day.